If you're drifting off, you're in the right place. Tonight, we're unraveling the not-so-glorious life of a knight's squire. Spoiler, it's less heroic legend and more unpaid, smelly nightmare. Let's snooze through some medieval misery. So you think being a knight's squire sounds romantic? All that chivalry, honor, and training for glory? Well, buckle up, because we're about to shatter every medieval fantasy you've ever had about this supposedly noble position. Being a squire wasn't a stepping stone to greatness. It was a one-way ticket to years of unpaid labor, constant humiliation, and the very real possibility of dying in someone else's armor while your knight took all the credit. Let's start with the basics. You're probably around 12 years old when this nightmare begins. That's right, 12. An age when modern kids are worried about middle school drama and whether their voice will crack during the school play. But you? You're being handed over to some grown man in metal pajamas who thinks beating the living daylights out of you is character building. Your parents, bless their ambitious hearts, have essentially sold you into indentured servitude disguised as opportunity. They've convinced themselves they're giving you a chance at nobility, but what they've actually done is traded their child for the vague possibility that you might, maybe, if you're incredibly lucky and don't die horribly, become a knight yourself someday. It's like sending your kid to an unpaid internship that lasts 7 years and comes with a significant risk of death. From day one, your life belongs to your knight. Not metaphorically, literally. You wake up when he wants you to wake up, which is usually before dawn because, apparently, knights believe the early bird catches the worm, and the worm in this case is your rapidly disappearing childhood. Your morning routine. Forget cereal and cartoons. You're up at the crack of dawn to help your knight get dressed. And medieval armor isn't a tracksuit. We're talking about dozens of pieces of metal that need to be fitted, adjusted, buckled, tied, and polished until they gleam like the armor in a fairy tale. Except fairy tales don't mention that armor smells like a combination of rust, sweat, and whatever your knight had for dinner 3 days ago. Each piece has a specific order, a specific way it must be worn, and God help you if you mess it up. The arming doublet goes on first. That's the padded jacket that's supposed to prevent the armor from chafing. Then the mail hauberk, which weighs about as much as a small child and makes a sound like a bag of angry coins every time your knight moves. Then the plate pieces. Cuirass for the chest, pauldrons for the shoulders, riri braces and vambraces for the arms, gauntlets for the hands, and so on, until your knight looks less like a person and more like a walking hardware store. And you better get it right the first time, because knights aren't known for their patience. Mess up the order, forget a buckle, or take too long, and you're likely to get a mailed fist to the side of the head. Consider it a learning experience. A painful, potentially concussion-inducing learning experience. But wait, there's more. While you're fumbling with armor that costs more than your entire village makes in a year, you're also expected to prepare your knight's weapons. His sword needs to be sharp enough to cut through a man, but clean enough to pass inspection. His lance needs to be straight, his shield needs to be polished, and his dagger needs to be accessible, but not so accessible that he accidentally stabs himself while mounting his horse. Oh, and speaking of horses, congratulations. You're now a stable boy too. Your knight's destrier, that massive war horse that could crush you like a grape, is now your responsibility. You feed it, water it, brush it, muck out its stall, and pray it doesn't decide to kick you into next week because you looked at it wrong. Here's where things get really fun. As a squire, you need to master the impossible art of being everywhere and nowhere at once. You must anticipate your knight's every need, while also staying completely out of his way. You're like a medieval personal assistant, except your boss wears armor and has legal permission to hit you with a sword. In the field, you follow your knight around like a heavily burdened shadow. You carry his extra weapons, his food, his water, his spare clothes, his medical supplies, and probably his collection of romantic poetry, because even medieval warriors had their hobbies. You're basically a walking supply closet with legs, and the constant threat of being trampled by a warhorse. During tournaments, your job is to make sure your knight looks good while you remain completely invisible. You polish his armor until it blinds spectators. You prepare his weapons until they're sharp enough to split hairs, and you make sure his horse is groomed to perfection. Then you stand on the sidelines and watch him get all the glory while you pray he doesn't get killed, because then you'd be out of a job and possibly blamed for his death. If your knight does well, he gets the prize money, the acclaim, and probably a kiss from some noble lady's silk handkerchief. You get to clean his armor afterward and listen to him brag about his prowess while you scrub blood and mud out of metal crevices with your bare hands. If your knight does poorly, well, that's obviously your fault for not polishing his sword bright enough, or not feeding his horse the right oats, or some other completely arbitrary reason. And let's talk about what happens when your knight actually goes to war. You might think this is where things get exciting, where you finally get to see some real action. Wrong. Dead wrong. You get to see action all right. The action of carrying supplies, setting up camp, and trying not to die while more qualified people do the actual fighting. Your job during a campaign is essentially to be a pack mule with opinions. You carry everything your knight might possibly need, which is approximately everything. Extra weapons, spare armor pieces, clothes, food, water, medical supplies, writing materials because knights love their dramatic letters home, and whatever random objects your knight has decided are essential to his success. One knight might insist on bringing his lucky goblet. Another might drag along a specific pillow. You get to carry it all while walking behind a horse that produces more manure in a day than your entire family eats in a week. When the army makes camp, you don't get to rest. While the knights are sitting around fires, discussing strategy and bragging about their past victories, you're setting up your knight's tent, preparing his meal, caring for his horse, and making sure his armor is ready for the next day's march. You're basically running a one-person medieval hotel service for someone who thinks thanking you would be beneath his dignity. And when battle actually happens, you're stuck in the worst possible position, close enough to the fighting to get killed by stray arrows or retreating soldiers, but far enough back that you can't actually contribute anything meaningful. You watch your knight ride off into combat while you stand there holding his spare lance and praying to every saint you can remember that he comes back alive. Because if he doesn't, you're suddenly unemployed in the middle of a battlefield, wearing the colors of a dead man, and surrounded by people who might decide you're worth more as a prisoner than as a witness. Let's say your knight survives the battle. Congratulations. Now you get to spend the next several hours cleaning blood, mud, and various other battlefield substances out of his armor. Medieval combat wasn't clean. It was messy, brutal, and left armor looking like it had been used to dig ditches in a butcher shop. You get to scrub every piece until it gleams again, all while listening to your knight recount his glorious deeds and wondering why his sword wasn't sharp enough, or his horse wasn't fast enough, or why you didn't anticipate his need for a specific weapon at exactly the right moment. But what if your knight doesn't survive? Well, then you're really in trouble. Suddenly, you're a teenager in a foreign country, possibly surrounded by enemies, with no money, no connections, and no clear way to get home. You might be taken prisoner and sold as a slave. You might be recruited by another knight who needs a squire and doesn't much care about your preferences. Or you might just die from exposure, starvation, or the general chaos that follows medieval battles. Even in peacetime, your education as a squire is basically a masterclass in humiliation and endurance. You're supposed to learn the arts of war, but mostly you learn the art of being yelled at by someone who thinks volume equals authority. Your knight will teach you swordplay by beating you senseless with wooden weapons. He'll teach you horsemanship by putting you on increasingly difficult horses and laughing when you fall off. He'll teach you the code of chivalry by demonstrating exactly how little it applies to squires. The physical training is brutal. You're expected to become proficient with every weapon your knight uses, which means hours of practice every day with swords, lances, maces, axes, and whatever other instruments of violence are currently fashionable. But you don't get to practice on straw dummies like in the movies. You practice on other squires, and since there's no referee and very little medical care, injuries are common and sometimes permanent. You'll spend countless hours learning to fight in armor, which is like learning to swim while wearing a refrigerator. Full-plate armor weighs 60 to 70 pounds and distributes that weight in ways that make every movement feel like you're fighting against gravity itself. The first time you put on a full suit of armor, you'll probably fall over. The second time, you'll fall over more gracefully. By the 100th time, you might be able to walk without looking like a drunken turtle, but you'll still sound like a bag of pots and pans falling downstairs every time you move. And let's not forget the most humiliating part of your training, learning to be a proper servant. Because that's what you are, really. A servant who occasionally gets to hold a sword. You learn how to serve meals without spilling wine on important people. You learn how to help your knight dress and undress without tangling him in his own chainmail. You learn how to maintain his equipment, manage his household, and basically run his entire life while he focuses on the important business of being noble and violent. You also get to learn fascinating skills like how to remove bloodstains from fabric, because knights are messy eaters and even messier fighters. You learn how to mend armor, because blacksmiths are expensive, and your knight would rather you figure it out than pay for professional repairs. You learn basic veterinary care, because that war horse is worth more than you are, and if it gets sick or injured, guess whose fault it is? The social aspect of being a squire is its own special kind of torture. You exist in a weird limbo between the common soldiers and the nobility. The soldiers see you as a spoiled rich kid playing at war. The nobles see you as a servant who occasionally gets to carry sharp objects. Nobody really sees you as a person with thoughts, feelings, or opinions worth considering. Other squires might seem like natural allies, but competition between squires is fierce and often nasty. You're all competing for the same limited spots as knights, and there are always more squires than there are opportunities for advancement. This leads to a constant atmosphere of backstabbing, sabotage, and petty revenge that makes middle school drama look sophisticated by comparison. Your knight's friends and associates will treat you like furniture that occasionally needs to be ordered around. They'll discuss you in your presence as if you're not there, critique your performance like you're a trained animal, and generally remind you that your entire worth is tied to how well you serve someone else's ambitions. And don't think the church offers any comfort. Medieval Christianity had some very specific ideas about hierarchy and your place in it. The priests will tell you that serving your knight is serving God, that humility is a virtue, and that your suffering in this life will be rewarded in the next. Basically, they'll tell you to shut up, work harder, and be grateful for the privilege of being treated like a particularly valuable piece of equipment. The food situation as a squire is another daily reminder of your low status. You eat what's left after your knight and his guests have finished. In a castle or manor, this might not be too bad. You might get decent bread, some meat, and ale that doesn't taste like it was brewed in a boot. But on campaign or during sieges, you're likely to be eating hardtack, whatever game you can catch, and water that may or may not be safe to drink. Your knight gets the best of everything: the finest meats, the freshest bread, the strongest wine. You get the scraps and the dregs, and you are expected to be grateful for them. Complain about the food, and you might not get any at all. Your knight's generosity extends only as far as his convenience, and keeping you well fed is a convenience, not a priority. Sleep is another luxury you learn to live without. Your knight might have his own tent, his own bed, his own privacy. You sleep on the ground outside his tent, ready to respond to his needs at any hour. If he wakes up in the middle of the night wanting water, you fetch it. If he needs help removing his armor after a feast, you help him, no matter how drunk he is or how much he might vomit on you in the process. The weather doesn't care about your comfort either. Hot summers mean wearing armor in blazing heat, sweating until you're dizzy and dehydrated. Cold winters mean shivering in inadequate clothing while making sure your knight stays warm and comfortable. Rain means everything you own gets soaked and stays that way until the sun comes out, which might be days or weeks. And through all of this, you're supposed to maintain the fiction that this is all worth it, because someday, maybe, you might become a knight yourself. The reality is that many squires never make it that far. Some die from disease, accident, or violence. Some are dismissed for failure to meet expectations. Some simply realize that the life of a knight isn't worth the years of abuse required to achieve it. Even if you do everything right, even if you're the perfect squire, your advancement depends entirely on your knight's whim and his financial situation. Knighting ceremonies cost money. Equipment for a new knight costs even more money. If your knight doesn't have the resources or doesn't think you're worth the investment, you might spend decades as a squire, growing old in service to someone who views you as permanently inferior. Let's talk about what happens when your knight decides to get married. Suddenly, your position in the household hierarchy gets even more complicated. The new lady of the house has her own ideas about how things should be run, and you might find yourself caught between conflicting orders from your knight and his wife. Medieval noblewomen weren't necessarily kind to their husbands' squires, especially if they saw you as a potential threat to their influence or a reminder of their husbands' bachelor days. You might find yourself reassigned to different duties, sent away to make room for your knight's new domestic arrangements, or simply dismissed because your presence is inconvenient. All those years of loyal service, and you can be discarded because your knight's new wife doesn't like the way you look at her. The medical care available to squires is roughly equivalent to what you'd get from a well-meaning drunk with a rusty knife. If you're injured in training or battle, you might receive basic first aid from someone who learned everything they know about medicine from watching other people die. Broken bones are set without anesthesia. Wounds are cleaned with whatever's handy, which might be wine if you're lucky, or dirty water if you're not. Infections are treated with prayer and whatever herbs someone thinks might help. Your knight's health and well-being are important. He has access to the best medical care available, which admittedly isn't great by modern standards, but it's infinitely better than what you get. If your knight is injured, trained physicians will be called. If you're injured, you might get some sympathy and a bandage made from someone's old shirt. The psychological toll of being a squire is something nobody talks about, but it's probably the worst part of the whole experience. You're isolated from your family, treated as less than human by the people around you, and constantly reminded that your worth depends entirely on someone else's opinion of your usefulness. You have no control over your own life, no privacy, no personal relationships that aren't subject to your knight's approval or interference. You're expected to be grateful for abuse, thankful for neglect, and enthusiastic about a future that may never come. The constant stress, the physical punishment, the social isolation, and the complete lack of agency would be enough to break most people. Many squires probably suffered from what we'd now recognize as depression, anxiety, and PTSD. But medieval society had no understanding of mental health and no sympathy for psychological weakness. If you show signs of emotional distress, you're likely to be labeled as weak, unreliable, or unsuitable for knighthood. There's no counseling, no support, no recognition that the system itself might be the problem. You're expected to suffer in silence and pretend that everything is fine, even when it obviously isn't. The irony of the whole system is that it's supposed to teach you the virtues of knighthood, honor, courage, loyalty, courtesy, and faith. But the reality is that it teaches you to endure abuse, accept injustice, and prioritize someone else's needs over your own well-being. It teaches you that power corrupts, and that the people with power will use it to make their lives easier at your expense. You learn that honor is selective, that courage is often just stupidity in expensive armor, and that loyalty is usually one-sided. You learn that courtesy is just a way of making cruelty seem civilized, and that faith is something people invoke when they want you to accept unfair treatment without complaint. The whole chivalric system is built on the backs of people like you, squires who do the real work while knights get the credit. You maintain the equipment, care for the horses, manage the logistics, and risk your lives in support roles, all so that someone else can play the hero. And when the stories are told, when the songs are sung, when the histories are written, you're footnotes at best, unnamed servants who happen to be present when great deeds were done. So the next time someone tells you how wonderful it would have been to live in medieval times, how romantic the age of chivalry was, how noble the knights were, remember the squires. Remember the children who were taken from their families and turned into unpaid servants. Remember the teenagers who died in foreign countries serving someone else's ambitions. Remember the young men who spent the best years of their lives learning that their dreams were less important than someone else's convenience. Being a knight's squire wasn't an adventure. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't noble. It was a brutal education in the reality that most people exist to serve the interests of a privileged few, and that the systems we create to justify this arrangement are often more cruel than honest tyranny would be. And if, after all of this, you still somehow manage to become a knight yourself, well, congratulations. Now you get to perpetuate the same system that nearly destroyed you, because that's what survivors do. They become the thing that hurt them, and they convince themselves that it was all worth it because look where they ended up. The cycle continues, and somewhere there's a new 12-year-old boy being told that he's getting the opportunity of a lifetime, that he should be grateful for the chance to serve, and that if he works hard and keeps his mouth shut, he might someday get to wear the armor instead of just polishing it. But hey, at least he gets to call himself a squire. That's got to count for something, right? And let's not forget about the wonderful world of medieval hygiene, or rather, the complete absence of it. As a squire, you're intimately familiar with your knight's personal habits. And trust me, intimately is definitely the wrong word to use here. You get to help him bathe, which happens about as often as solar eclipses and is roughly as pleasant as you'd expect from someone who spends most of his time sweating inside metal armor. Medieval bathing wasn't the relaxing spa experience you might imagine. It was more like a cross between a military operation and a medical procedure. You heat the water, assuming you can find clean water, which is never guaranteed. You test the temperature with your own skin, because your knight's comfort is more important than your potential burns. You help him out of his clothes, which by this point have achieved a level of stench that could be classified as a weapon of war. The water goes from clear to murky in record time. Your job is to scrub the accumulated grime, sweat, and battlefield debris from your knight's body while trying not to breathe through your nose. It's like archaeological excavation, but with more complaining and less historical significance. And once the bath is over, you get to dispose of the water, which now resembles a soup that no one in their right mind would consider edible. But the real fun begins when your knight gets sick. Medieval medicine was essentially a combination of guesswork, superstition, and wishful thinking, with a healthy dose of making things worse thrown in for good measure. As his squire, you become his primary caregiver, which means you get to witness firsthand the various and creative ways the human body can malfunction. Your knight might develop dysentery, which turns your life into a constant cycle of cleaning up bodily fluids and pretending you don't notice the smell. Or he might catch some mysterious fever that makes him delirious, in which case you get to listen to him ramble about his childhood, his enemies, and his various romantic disappointments, while trying to keep him from throwing himself out of bed. Medieval treatments were often worse than the diseases they were supposed to cure. Your knight might be prescribed bloodletting, which means you get to watch someone drain what little healthy blood he has left. Or he might be given various herbal concoctions that smell like rotting vegetation and taste like regret. Your job is to administer these treatments, monitor his condition, and somehow keep him alive despite the best efforts of medieval medicine. And if your knight dies while under your care, well, that's obviously your fault. Never mind that he was treated with leeches and mercury. Never mind that the physician's idea of sterile technique was wiping his hands on his shirt. You were the one responsible for his well-being, so his death must be due to your negligence, incompetence, or possibly witchcraft. Speaking of witchcraft, that's another constant worry for squires. Medieval society was deeply suspicious of anything that couldn't be easily explained. And as someone who spends a lot of time around weapons, armor, and potentially dangerous substances, you're always at risk of being accused of supernatural malfeasance. If your knight's sword breaks at an inconvenient moment, maybe you cursed it. If his horse goes lame, maybe you've been feeding it witches' herbs. If he loses a tournament, maybe you've been consorting with demons to sabotage his performance. The accusations don't have to make sense. They don't have to be based on evidence. They just have to be convenient for someone who wants to explain away their problems or settle a score. and once you're accused of witchcraft, your life expectancy drops dramatically. Medieval justice wasn't particularly concerned with proving guilt. It was more focused on making someone pay for whatever had gone wrong. Let's talk about the romantic life of a squire, or rather, the complete absence of one. Your entire existence revolves around serving someone else, which doesn't leave much time for personal relationships. You're constantly traveling, constantly working, constantly under supervision. Any free time you might have is spent sleeping, eating, or trying to recover from whatever punishment you've received for your latest supposed failure. If you do manage to develop feelings for someone, a village girl you meet during travels perhaps, or a servant in one of the castles you visit, you have to keep it secret. Your knight controls every aspect of your life, including your romantic interests. He might forbid the relationship because it's inconvenient, because he disapproves of the girl's social status, or simply because he doesn't want to deal with the complications that come with a love-struck squire. And even if your knight approves of your romantic interests, you have no resources to pursue them properly. You have no money for gifts, no time for courtship, no privacy for intimate conversations. You're essentially trying to conduct a relationship while living under the constant surveillance of someone who views your personal happiness as a potential threat to your professional usefulness. Marriage? That's a luxury for people who have control over their own lives. As a squire, you can't marry without your knight's permission, and even if he grants it, you have no way to support a wife or family. Your earnings, such as they are, belong to your knight. Your time belongs to your knight. Your future belongs to your knight. There's nothing left over for a family of your own. Some squires do manage to marry, usually to women who understand that their husband's first loyalty will always be to his knight. These marriages are often strained by long separations, financial hardship, and the constant uncertainty that comes with a life of service. The wife of a squire is essentially a military widow who gets to see her husband occasionally, assuming he doesn't die in someone else's war. Children complicate things even further. If you have children as a squire, you can't provide for them properly, can't spend time with them, can't even protect them if your knight decides they're inconvenient. Your children grow up knowing that their father's loyalty belongs to someone else, that their needs come second to the whims of a man they may never meet. The economic reality of being a squire is another source of constant stress. You're not paid a salary in any modern sense. You might receive occasional gifts from your knight, small amounts of money for personal expenses, or the promise of future rewards if you serve faithfully. But you have no job security, no benefits, no retirement plan. Your entire financial future depends on your knight's continued goodwill and his ability to eventually make you a knight yourself. Even if you successfully complete your training and become eligible for knighthood, the ceremony itself costs money that you don't have. You need your own armor, your own weapons, your own horse, and your own equipment. These items cost more than most people earn in a lifetime. If your knight can't or won't provide them, you're stuck as a permanent squire, fully trained but never advanced. Some squires spend decades in this limbo, too qualified to be dismissed but too expensive to promote. They become professional servants, growing old in the service of men who view them as useful but ultimately replaceable. They watch younger squires come and go, some advancing to knighthood while others fail or die, and they realize that their own advancement may never come. The political aspects of medieval life add another layer of complexity to the squire's existence. Your knight has allies and enemies, and by extension, so do you. If your knight falls out of favor with his lord, you might find yourself on the wrong side of a political dispute through no fault of your own. If your knight chooses the losing side in a civil war, you might be branded a traitor along with him. Medieval politics were personal, vindictive, and often lethal. Today's ally could be tomorrow's enemy, and squires were often caught in the middle of these shifting alliances. You might find yourself serving a knight who was once your lord's trusted vassal, but is now considered a rebel or traitor. Your loyalty to your knight conflicts with your loyalty to your lord, and there's no good way to resolve the contradiction. If your knight is killed in battle or executed for treason, you don't get to plead innocence by association. You were his squire, his trusted servant, his potential accomplice. You might be imprisoned, exiled, or killed along with him. Even if you're spared, you're now unemployed and unemployable, marked as the former servant of a traitor. The religious aspects of medieval life provide their own challenges for squires. You're expected to be devout, to attend services regularly, to live according to Christian principles. But you're also expected to serve a knight who might engage in activities that contradict those principles. Your knight might loot churches, kill non-combatants, or break oaths when it's convenient. Your job is to serve him faithfully, regardless of your moral qualms. The Church preaches humility, charity, and forgiveness. Your knight practices pride, greed, and revenge. You're caught between these conflicting value systems, trying to serve God while also serving a man who might be committing sins on a daily basis. The priests tell you that obedience to your social superiors is a form of obedience to God. But what happens when your social superior is acting in ways that seem fundamentally ungodly? Some squires develop a kind of moral numbness, learning to compartmentalize their religious beliefs and their professional duties. Others struggle with guilt and doubt, wondering if their service to a violent master is damning their souls. A few rebel against the system entirely, but rebellion usually leads to punishment, disgrace, or death. The seasonal nature of medieval warfare adds its own rhythm of suffering to the squire's life. Spring and summer are campaign seasons, when armies march and battles are fought. These are the times of greatest danger, when you're most likely to die from violence, disease, or accident. But they're also the times when you're most likely to prove your worth, to gain experience, and to advance in your knight's estimation. Fall and winter are theoretically peaceful times, when armies return home and knights settle into their castles or manors. But peace doesn't mean rest for a squire. Winter is maintenance season, when you spend countless hours repairing equipment, caring for animals, and preparing for the next year's campaigns. It's also the time when your knight is most likely to be bored, drunk, and looking for someone to blame for his various frustrations. The cycle repeats year after year, each campaign bringing new dangers and new disappointments. You watch other squires advance or die. You see knights rise and fall, and you begin to understand that your individual fate matters very little in the grand scheme of medieval politics and warfare. You're a small part of a vast machine designed to concentrate wealth and power in the hands of a few dozen noble families, and your suffering is just the price of keeping that machine running. Let's talk about the legal status of squires, which is to say, you barely have any legal status at all. In the eyes of medieval law, you're somewhere between a servant and a piece of property. You can't own land, can't make contracts, can't testify against nobles in court. If someone wrongs you, your only recourse is to appeal to your knight for justice, and his idea of justice might not align with yours. If you're injured by someone else's negligence, you can't sue for damages. If someone steals from you, you can't press charges. If someone assaults you, you can't demand punishment unless your knight decides your injuries are worth avenging. Your knight might seek compensation for damage to his property, meaning you, but that compensation goes to him, not to you. The flip side of this legal vulnerability is that you're also held responsible for your knight's actions in some circumstances. If your knight commits a crime and flees, you might be held as surety for his behavior. If he owes money and can't pay, you might be imprisoned until the debt is settled. Your legal status makes you simultaneously powerless and liable, a combination that ensures you're always at risk. Medieval courts weren't particularly interested in justice in any modern sense. They were more focused on maintaining social order and protecting the interests of the powerful. As a squire, you represent a potential threat to that order. You're trained in violence, but not fully integrated into the noble class. You have access to weapons and military knowledge, but no stake in the system that employs you. Courts view you with suspicion, as someone who might be easily corrupted or turned against his betters. This suspicion affects every interaction you have with legal authorities. If there's a crime in the area where you're traveling, you might be questioned simply because you're armed and don't belong to the local community. If there's unrest among the common people, you might be suspected of fomenting rebellion because of your military training. If there's a dispute between nobles, you might be accused of espionage because you have access to your knight's plans and correspondence. The educational aspects of being a squire are often romanticized in modern retellings, but the reality was far more brutal and limited than most people realize. Yes, you learn to fight, but you learn by being beaten repeatedly by people who are stronger, more experienced, and better equipped than you are. You learn to ride horses, but you learn by being thrown from increasingly difficult mounts until you develop the balance and skill to stay on. You're supposed to learn reading and writing, but many knights are themselves illiterate, and even those who can read may not bother to teach you. Literacy is a luxury, not a necessity, and your knight might decide that an educated squire is more trouble than he's worth. If you do learn to read, it's probably just enough to help manage your knight's correspondence and accounts, not enough to read for pleasure or self-improvement. The famous courtly education, learning music, poetry, and the arts of civilization is mostly fiction. Most squires are too busy with practical tasks to spend time on cultural refinement. If you're lucky enough to serve in a court where such education is available, you're probably too exhausted from your regular duties to take advantage of it. What you do learn is practical knowledge that doesn't appear in any manual of chivalry. You learn how to recognize the signs of disease in horses. You learn how to start a fire in wet conditions. You learn how to find clean water in unfamiliar territory. You learn how to sleep in armor without dying of heat exhaustion. You learn how to tell when someone is lying to you about the quality of food or the safety of roads. These skills are valuable, but they're not the kind of knowledge that elevates you socially or opens doors to better opportunities. They're survival skills, the kind of practical education that helps you endure a difficult life rather than escape it. The international aspect of medieval warfare means that squires often find themselves in foreign countries, dealing with unfamiliar languages, customs, and dangers. Your knight might be called to serve in a crusade, which means months or years of travel through hostile territory, fighting people whose culture and religion you don't understand, for reasons that may not be entirely clear to you. Language barriers make everything more difficult. You can't ask for directions, can't negotiate for supplies, can't even insult your enemies effectively. You're dependent on your knight and other nobles for communication, which puts you at a disadvantage in every interaction with local populations. Cultural differences can be dangerous. What's considered polite behavior in your home country might be seen as insulting or threatening elsewhere. Religious practices that are normal at home might be viewed as heretical or blasphemous in foreign lands. Even basic gestures and social customs can lead to misunderstandings that escalate into violence. The logistics of maintaining a knight's equipment and supplies in foreign territory are nightmarish. You can't always find the right materials for repairs. Local craftsmen may not understand your needs or may charge exorbitant prices for their services. Climate differences can damage equipment in unexpected ways. Desert heat can make armor unbearable, while cold weather can make metal brittle and prone to breaking. Disease is a constant threat when traveling in foreign lands. Your body isn't adapted to local pathogens, and medieval medicine has no understanding of disease transmission or prevention. You might develop dysentery from contaminated water, fever from insect bites, or respiratory infections from unfamiliar climates. Medical care in foreign countries is often even worse than what you'd receive at home, assuming you can find anyone willing to treat a foreign soldier. The return journey from foreign campaigns is often more dangerous than the outbound trip. Armies are depleted by casualties, weakened by disease, and burdened by wounded soldiers who can't travel quickly. Local populations may be hostile to retreating forces, seeing them as vulnerable targets for attack. Pirates and bandits know that returning crusaders often carry loot and are therefore worth robbing. Even if you survive the campaign and make it home, you might find that years of foreign service have changed you in ways that make it difficult to readjust to domestic life. You've seen things that your family and friends can't understand. You've experienced violence, privation, and cultural shock that have left psychological scars. But medieval society has no concept of post-traumatic stress, and no sympathy for soldiers who can't simply return to normal life. The technological changes during the medieval period also affected squires in ways that aren't often discussed. The gradual improvement in armor design meant that squires had to learn increasingly complex maintenance procedures. Early male armor was relatively simple to care for, but later plate armor required specialized knowledge and tools. If you couldn't keep up with these technological changes, you became less valuable to your knight. Similarly, changes in weapons technology required constant retraining. The introduction of crossbows changed battlefield tactics. The development of gunpowder weapons revolutionized siege warfare. As a squire, you had to adapt to these changes without any formal training program or structured education. You learned by trial and error, often with your life at stake. The rise of professional armies and mercenary companies also threatened the traditional role of squires. Knights began hiring experienced soldiers rather than training young nobles. This meant fewer opportunities for advancement and more competition for the positions that remained available. Some squires found themselves competing not just with other squires, but with professional soldiers who had years of combat experience. Castle life, when you're lucky enough to experience it, brings its own unique forms of misery. Castles are cold, damp, and poorly ventilated. The walls are thick stone that holds moisture and never quite dry out. Your quarters, assuming you have quarters and aren't sleeping in a hallway or stable, are likely to be cramped, dark, and shared with other servants. The social hierarchy in a castle is rigid and unforgiving. Everyone knows their place, and stepping out of line brings swift punishment. As a squire, you're above the common servants but well below the nobles. This means you get contempt from above and resentment from below. The servants see you as a privileged brat who gets special treatment. The nobles see you as a servant who occasionally gets to play with weapons. Castle politics are vicious and petty. Nobles with too much time and too little to do often engage in elaborate schemes to advance their position or undermine their rivals. As a squire, you're caught in the middle of these machinations, expected to be loyal to your knight, while also navigating the complex web of alliances and enmities that define castle social life. The food in castles is theoretically better than campaign rations, but that's not saying much. The kitchens are filthy, the cooks are often drunk, and the ingredients are of questionable quality. Meat is often spoiled, vegetables are frequently rotten, and the bread is hard enough to be used as a weapon. The nobles get the best of what's available, which still isn't very good, and you get what's left, which is often borderline inedible. Entertainment in castles usually involves watching other people have fun while you work. There might be feasts, tournaments, or musical performances, but you're too busy serving to enjoy them. If you're lucky, you might get to watch from the sidelines while making sure your knight has everything he needs. More often, you're in the kitchen, the stable, or the armory, missing the festivities entirely. The winter months in a castle are particularly brutal. Heating is primitive and ineffective. The stone walls and floors radiate cold that seeps into your bones and never quite leaves. Firewood is rationed, and squires are low on the priority list for fuel allocation. You might spend entire days shivering while making sure your knight stays warm and comfortable. Let's discuss the peculiar relationship between squires and the church, which manages to be both supportive and oppressive at the same time. The church preaches that all Christians are equal in the eyes of God, but it also supports the social hierarchy that keeps squires in their subordinate position. Priests will tell you that your suffering has spiritual value, that serving your knight is a form of serving God, and that your reward will come in the afterlife. This theological framework provides a justification for the abuse and exploitation you experience, making it not just socially acceptable, but morally necessary. Your knight isn't just using you for his convenience. He's helping you achieve salvation through submission and sacrifice. Your pain isn't just the result of an unfair system. It's a test of your faith and character. The church also provides some of the only education available to squires, but it's education with a very specific purpose. You might learn to read, but only so you can read religious texts. You might learn to write, but only so you can copy prayers and psalms. You might learn basic mathematics, but only so you can calculate tithe payments and manage church finances. This religious education comes with heavy indoctrination about your place in the world, and your duty to accept that place without complaint. You're taught that questioning authority is sinful, that ambition is prideful, and that contentment with your lot is a virtue. The church effectively collaborates with the secular hierarchy to ensure that squires never develop the intellectual tools or moral framework necessary to challenge their subordination. Some squires find genuine comfort in religious faith, using prayer and devotion as a way to cope with their difficult circumstances. But even this comfort comes at a cost, as religious devotion in medieval times often involved extreme practices like fasting, self-flagellation, and other forms of self-punishment that add to rather than alleviate suffering. The relationship between squires and women in medieval society is another complicated aspect of this already complex social position. You are simultaneously above and below women in the social hierarchy, depending on their noble status and family connections. A noble lady outranks you completely and can order you around as she pleases. A peasant woman is technically beneath you in social status, but you have no practical authority over her and no resources to attract her interest. The chivalric code requires you to be courteous and protective toward women, but this courtesy is highly conditional. You're supposed to protect noble women from harm, but you have no obligation to help common women who might be in danger. You're supposed to be respectful toward ladies of the court, but you're also expected to ignore their faults and overlook their sometimes cruel treatment of social inferiors. The romantic ideals of chivalry create additional complications. You're supposed to be inspired by pure love for some noble lady, but you're also supposed to remain chaste and devoted to your knightly duties. This creates an impossible psychological tension between human desires and social expectations. You're encouraged to develop romantic feelings that can never be consummated, and to express devotion that can never be reciprocated. Some squires develop deep emotional attachments to noble ladies they serve, but these relationships are doomed from the start. The social gap is too wide to bridge, and any attempt at actual romance would be seen as presumptuous at best and criminal at worst. You might spend years nurturing feelings for someone who barely acknowledges your existence as a person. The physical realities of medieval life also create challenges specific to squires. You're constantly exposed to the elements, traveling in all weather without adequate protection. Your clothing is practical rather than comfortable, designed to be durable rather than warm or dry. You spend long hours on horseback, leading to chronic back pain, saddle sores, and other physical problems that never quite heal. The diet of a squire is nutritionally inadequate by modern standards. You get enough calories to function, assuming food is available, but you're probably deficient in vitamins, minerals, and other nutrients necessary for optimal health. This leads to various health problems: scurvy from lack of vitamin C, rickets from lack of vitamin D, anemia from inadequate iron intake, and dental problems from poor nutrition and lack of hygiene. Sleep deprivation is another constant problem. You're expected to be available to your knight at all hours, which means your sleep is frequently interrupted. Quality sleep is difficult to achieve when you're sleeping on the ground, in uncomfortable conditions, or in noisy environments. Chronic sleep deprivation affects your judgment, reaction time, and emotional stability, making you more prone to accidents and mistakes. The cumulative effect of these physical stresses is that most squires age rapidly and die young. The combination of violence, disease, malnutrition, and exhaustion takes a heavy toll on the human body. Even if you avoid death in battle, you're likely to suffer from chronic health problems that will affect the rest of your life. And through all of this, through every hardship and humiliation, through every moment of pain and degradation, you're expected to maintain the fiction that you're grateful for the opportunity to serve. You're supposed to smile when you're beaten, thank your knight for his corrections, and express enthusiasm for a future that grows more distant with each passing year. You're living proof that the chivalric system is built on the suffering of the young and the powerless, but you're also its most devoted defender, because admitting the truth about your situation would mean acknowledging that you've wasted years of your life in service to an illusion. It's easier to believe that your suffering has meaning, that your sacrifice will be rewarded, and that the system that crushes you is somehow noble and just. And perhaps that's the most tragic aspect of being a night squire. Not the physical abuse, not the social humiliation, not even the constant danger. The most tragic thing is that the system trains you to collaborate in your own oppression, to defend the very hierarchy that denies you dignity, agency, and hope. Because what's the alternative? If you admit that chivalry is a lie, that knighthood is just violence dressed up in pretty words, that your years of service have been meaningless, then what do you have left? Better to believe in the dream, even when the dream is killing you slowly, than to face the reality that you've been used and discarded by people who never saw you as fully human. So you polish the armor, sharpen the swords, tend the horses, and tell yourself that someday it will all be worth it. Someday you'll be the one in the shining armor, and some other child will be cleaning your boots and dreaming of glory. The cycle continues, and the system perpetuates itself, fed by the hopes and suffering of each new generation of squires who believe they can be the exception to the rule. But they're not exceptions. They're the rule. And the rule is that most squires will never become knights, most dreams will never be realized, and most suffering will never be rewarded. The system doesn't exist to elevate the worthy. It exists to exploit the hopeful. And there's always another 12-year-old boy ready to believe that this time will be different, that his service will be valued, that his sacrifice will matter. It won't. But by the time he figures that out, it's too late to change course, and there's already another